Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Squawk Box. We are live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. If you take a look at the futures this morning, we are looking at some trading in the green. This is not a massive bounce back for the NASDAQ after the pretty significant declines we saw yesterday, a drop of more than 3%. But you are looking at the NASDAQ indicated up by close to 100 points right now. Dow futures are up by 20. The S&P futures up by about 17.
Meantime, activist short seller Andrew left. This is fascinating, and we should have a debate about this. He wants answers from the SEC. We interviewed him here, of course, on the air a couple of weeks ago now. A law firm has now filed a formal petition with the agency on behalf, I should say, his behalf, calling for rules to clarify what and when investors who publicly comment on securities can trade, for example. So if an investor goes on TV, for example, or has a Substack account, or goes onto Twitter last Friday, ends up talking about liking NVIDIA, I'm making this up as an example, could he then go sell NVIDIA yesterday?
When the story changed.
Or is he not allowed to?
Right.
Last summer, authorities accused Left of manipulating the market and defrauding investors by making misleading statements about his positions in well-known stocks. The SEC and the Department of Justice focusing on how Left publicly describes his positions, oftentimes with goal targets and the like, and then how he actually traded. So in some instances, he would say, I'm long this. I think that the target of the company should be this. I'm holding it. And then, the company, then he, right before the earnings call, he would sell it before it ever reached his target.
Well, that's interesting.
And so the question is, when you disclose or when you declare something, is a goal, is your target, we have analysts who come on all the time. They say their target is X, Y, Z.
Do you have to then issue some public statement, some posting on X, some social media issuance? Do you have to go back to the original location of where you said it? Because it would make things pretty complicated for an operation like ours.
Well, I think like ours, but I think you have so many investors now who are on podcasts. Look, Warren Buffett publicly goes at annual meetings and talks about how he thinks Apple is great or this is that. And then, of course, sometimes you'll have very famed investors say, I like something, and then you'll read the 13D 3 months later, and you'll find out that
3 months later and 3 days later is a pretty big difference. Well, but because one looks like you have created the furor either in favor of or against the selling pressure coming down.
But the 3 months later is you don't know when they sold during that.
But the interesting point is the SEC can then find out. If you go back to everybody who looks differently, the SEC can 100%. Then go back. And if you sold 24 hours after coming in and saying, this is the greatest stock ever, the stock goes up 17% and you sell it, should you be held accountable if...
Well, this is the question.
If you don't tell anybody and it didn't, and by the way, it's up 17%, but you said it was going to be up 150%, and you changed your mind going into it. Obviously, the SEC is trying to create examples and trying to create fear, and that's what the last SEC did.
Right. Now,
under the last chairman, they were trying to create enough of a concern factor, like they did with Bitcoin, that people just wouldn't do it. They made a lot of public examples where they were just trying to change behavior.
I hate the idea of a pump and dump, what they call a rug pull now in the business.
Yeah.
I'm actually more concerned about what I've described as the sort of the new age pool, where you have multiple people operating together to try to pump up a stock, knowing that they're going to pull it.
You're talking about meme stocks.
Meme stocks, but other stocks as well. This is now going on, on Reddit and on Telegram and on DMs and Twitter. People are doing this. That's one thing. I have a freedom of speech issue, which is if you want to say that you believe something is great, you should be allowed to do it. And
you have the absolute freedom of speech, but that does not correlate to freedom of speech with doing one thing, saying one thing and doing another when it comes to security. So the SEC does have the authority to come in and do that.
There's a question about manipulation, and there's a question, though, about how much power you have. And this is what's so interesting to me, which is if Joe Blow on the street were to come on our show and say that he loves NVIDIA, he might not have the power to move a stock, okay?
With great power comes great responsibility.
And then, however, Roaring Kitty has power. Warren Buffett has power. Bill Ackman might have power. Somebody else, an analyst, by the way, a new analyst at a bank that you either never heard of or heard of, might have no power.
But an axe on the beat
But
might
it's
have
very
some
interesting
power.
to then sort of decipher who's got power, who doesn't have power. I think it's a very sort of, talk about slippery slope. And
I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is, but I don't think you can say Flat out, it's a free speech issue. You can say whatever you want, but when you act and potentially manipulate securities around it, that's a different situation. And I'm not accusing Andrew Left of this. I'm sympathetic to his argument that he laid out on the program.
To me, the manipulation issue is if there are records or other things that suggest that somebody says, I'm going to come on either TV or I'm going to put out a tweet or I'm going to go on my Substack account or go on a podcast and I'm going to say, this stock's going $100. By the way, I've already put in an order to sell it at 30.
Right.
Or that there's some evidence that this is like a genuine effort to pump the stock to get to then sell it immediately. That to me is manipulation. If you put out a target and then you happen to say, okay, it's actually gone up a lot, I'm getting out of this right now.
Look, I can understand Andrew Left wanting the rules of the road to be put out there so that people can look at this clearly, but I think it was an intentional situation from the last SEC enforcement agency.
The SEC forever, it's not even this last, the SEC forever has been gray on this.
No, but I think Gary Gensler intentionally did a lot of gray activity and going after high-profile things with Bitcoin in particular to try and scare people into not doing things. And I think the SEC would like to be a little gray on the matter so that people walk a little more carefully. It's a cop on the beat type of situation, and it's going to change from agency head to agency head.
Okay, when we come back, a lot more on Squawk. We're going to have a conversation about technology, divisiveness in this country, what is dividing America, how social media is playing in it, and so much more. Chris Hayes is going to be with us. Got a new book out that gets at the very heart of all of this, irrespective of your own politics. We're going to break it all down after this. Welcome back to Squawk Box. We often talk about political division in our country, and our next guest has a theory behind what may be fueling that situation. Chris Hayes is the host of MSNBC's All In with Chris Hayes. He is the author of a fascinating new book. It is titled The Siren's Call, in which he argues that technology companies have triggered a national crisis by developing products that significantly reduce our attention spans and, as a result, may be dividing us. Good morning to you.
It's good to see you.
So, help us understand this, because we talk a lot about social media on this broadcast. We talk about X on one side and Instagram on another. So there's sort of two theories of the case, I think, running through this book. One is just about the role of of the media, but also the role of how it's dividing us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to think about it is that attention, in an information-rich environment, right, which is the information economy, Herb Simon has this insight back in the 1970s that attention is the scarce resource. Right? Information consumes attention. Information is basically infinite and replicable. There's tons of data out there. The thing that's finite is our attention. It can only be in one place or another. Mm-hmm. And so attention becomes actually the really important currency of the age. And in fact, when you look at companies like Google and Meta, right, what are they actually monetizing? They're actually monetizing our attention, much more than they're monetizing information. When you get competitive attention markets, right, what you are driving towards is the most outrageous, the most negative, the thing that is triggering the part of our brainstem that is most conditioned for threat, right, and the lurid. And so we're all sort of in this universe of these incredibly intense attention markets that are always going to kind of drive to that lowest.
So that's the question. Is there a business model that you could even imagine that would allow us to use these type of services and yet not play the attention, either be in the attention business, but without having to take everything to the extent that it goes, whether you're on the far right or far left?
One of the things I think is worth considering about the evolution of digital life is that the first iteration of the internet was an entirely commercial universe with AOL, Prodigy, CompuServe, right? Mm-hmm. And AOL was the belle of the ball, and of course it was like the largest company, and they bought Time Warner. And that was actually replaced by a non-commercial open version of the internet. The thing that gave us Wikipedia, Mark Andreessen's developing of the Mosaic web browser, was that all of a sudden you busted out of these small platforms, right, which was AOL and CompuServe, and you actually had an open internet that was fundamentally in its interactions non-commercial in the space you occupied. We've now gone back to a universe in which we're all operating commercial spaces all the time. Right? So the platform in every instance has a goal, which is to maximize the use of your attention. It does not actually have to be that way. I mean, there are non-commercial
so that's where I wanted
ways.
to go with this, when you say it doesn't have to be that way.
Well, because we had an open internet before. There are still platforms that are relatively open. There's still protocols that are relatively open. Podcast is a great example.
It's clunky, and it's harder to get to some of this stuff.
Exactly, and that's the sort of trade-off, right? But podcasts are a great example, right? Podcasts operate on an open protocol. They operate off the back of RSS, which was developed years ago that like anyone can use. And when you hear the phrase wherever you get your podcasts.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That's like the openness
right.
of the old internet, that it's not contained in a platform that in every moment is trying to monetize your attention.
Look, I agree with you. I think that is totally the goal of this,
Yeah.
and we feed off these negative things. But I would also say that the precursor to what we see with social media companies right now are the cable companies. The cable companies do the same thing.
Totally, yes.
And for decades, people were blaming the cable companies, particularly the far right and the far left, in terms of politics, was saying the cable companies
they are monetizing this. Yes,
and they're doing the same thing, and they're trying to rise people up and give this rabid sort of delivery, and that's why the ratings were so good for cable companies.
And believe me, I mean, I live this every day.
I know, that's why I'm.
And the thing that I think, about, the way that I think about our role as journalists, right, is like the Fed's dual mandate.
Okay.
Right?
This is interesting. I like this. Coming to Squawk with some real
central bankers have a dual mandate, and they have to basically deal with two goals that are in tension with each other, which is why it's hard to be a central banker, right? They want to keep unemployment low, they want to keep inflation low, the growth high, right? And those, sometimes there's trade-offs between them. In journalism, what I'm trying to do is like keep people's attention and also give them the tools for self-governance and information.
You're just mad that somebody is out angering the crowds and getting them more addicted on social media than we do on television.
Well, no, because I actually think there's like an actual civic role for journalism that's being destroyed.
I agree, but I would also say that some of the far right and far left that we see in politics is not straight up journalism. It is taking a side and a perspective and then heating and fomenting.
Totally, and I think that attentional incentives for that are enormous.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it all the time. Our politics are defined by a kind of trolling now.
So where do you land ultimately on the sort of community notes of it all? And both in the sort of X land and increasingly now it's going to be in the meta land. I ask because there's an element to which you can argue that there's sort of like a truth to it, right? It's everybody can just put up whatever they want. There are no journalism, no gatekeepers. Someone on the street down here will see somebody do something and they'll just write in that this is what just happened. Whether it's, and it might be right, it might be wrong. Somebody might have a video of it, but that there were no the gatekeepers are all of us. Are we better? Who is the better gatekeeper? No, I actually think this is the fundamental question, right? Do we want gatekeepers? Do we not want gatekeepers? And I'm very mixed views of the situation. I have very, very mixed views of it because, interestingly, I go back actually to 2020, and I think about vaccines. I think about, by the way, there was like a whole meme craze. And, someone like myself, I would come on the air and I would say, be careful, folks. I think this is a little bit anxiety producing. And people would say, I don't need you to be my parent. Stop trying to protect me. And by the way, you're trying to protect me from the man. You're trying to protect the man. You're not trying to protect me. And it's a very interesting sort of like flip of what I thought the responsibilities of a journalist were supposed to be. People were said, you're not supposed to be protecting us from these things. We actually want to see them. We want to know it. Anyway.
Well, so here's my thing.
I don't know the answer.
So I write in the book about what I call attentional regimes, like a debate, Lincoln Douglas, right? Like any social interaction, any meeting, right, has an attentional regime, like who can speak when, what you're talking about, an agenda. And that's necessary because attention is a means towards some end. What we're seeing is when you have a breakdown of attentional regimes, the end itself is attention. It's just getting attention and nothing else, right? So part of what I'm talking, when you talk about gatekeepers, it's like, what is the purpose of whatever given platform is? Is it just to maximize the seconds of eyeballs on it? Or is it to do something else, like give people the tools they need to invest or to like run a democracy?
But ultimately, the additional choice leaves the choice up to the viewer. Do you want to spend more time with this gated community where people you decide you trust or don't trust are feeding you things, or do you want to have access to anything and everything? And that's
sure, and I think I think people can go both ways, right? There's different parts of ourselves. I think what we've ended up doing is basically reinventing the village rumor. Right? So the idea that like you're the media is like, yeah, well, we've had that for hundreds of years, right? The Salem witch trials was you are the media. She looks like a witch. Like we've definitely tried that before.
Chris Hayes, the book is called The Siren's Call, and let me just say, really, no matter what your politics, I could actually see somebody who's completely far on the right level of this
totally.
book,
It's
and
not
I think
mostly
far on the left. It doesn't matter. But it's fascinating because it really gets at, I think, what's happening in society. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Chris. Still ahead this morning, GM CEO Mary
Commerce Committee setting to hold a hearing today on the impact of the Panama Canal on U.S. trade and national security. President Trump has now accused China of operating the canal and vowing during his inaugural address to take it back. Panama strongly criticizing those ideas. Joining us right now is the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, it's great to have you on the broadcast as always. What do you think the true prospect is of, quote unquote, taking back the Panama Canal? What would it cost? How would you do it? And all of the questions that surround it.
Well, Andrew, tomorrow morning, the Senate Commerce Committee is going to have a hearing on the Panama Canal and the impacts on the United States. I'll tell you, when President Trump first raised this, a lot of people, particularly the media, scoffed, but I think he raised two very serious issues, which is, number one, as you noted, that China has a very significant position in Panama. China has leased and has locations on both ends of the Panama Canal that gives it observation and potentially control of the Panama Canal. Not only that, but China is building a bridge that goes over the Panama Canal that gives them the ability to shut down transit on the Panama Canal. That is a serious both economic threat and national security threat. And number two, the nation of Panama is charging very significant fees, predominantly to the United States, both to commercial shippers and to the U.S. Navy when it transits that canal. And it's worth remembering, the United States built that canal at the cost of over 30,000 lives, at the cost of, in today's dollars, $15 trillion. And when Jimmy Carter gave that canal away, I got to tell you, I was a little kid, but I remember it was I think, shocking at the time. But when he gave that canal away to Panama, he did so pursuant to a treaty that obligated Panama to treat the United States fairly. And so the hearing we're going to have tomorrow is going to be examining how much Panama is complying with the treaty or how much they are in violation of the treaty. And violating a treaty has real consequences. So,
Senator, here's one of the big questions I think that we all have. Let's say we can agree or even stipulate. I don't know whether we agree or we don't, but let's just say that President Carter made a huge strategic error on behalf of the United States by giving away the Panama Canal. Let's just say that for the sake of the conversation. Even if that's the case, then the question to me becomes, and let's say you want it back somehow.
Yeah.
The question is, should it be just, quote unquote, bought back on a commercial basis? And in fact, if they don't want to sell it, that's just the way it is. Or do you believe that we, the United States, should be in a position to either use coercion economically or militarily or anything else to get at that? And if that's the case, then what does that mean for just about everything else that we are doing on the global stage and, frankly, what other countries are doing?
So listen, that's a fair question, and let me be clear at the outset. I'm not in favor of using military force to go invade other countries. I don't think that's the job of our military. But let me point out, Panama is a very different issue from Greenland. Greenland, the president has raised as well, and I think Greenland is a very serious proposal. I think Greenland would have very significant both national security and economic advantages. Greenland is up on the Arctic. Any military battle with either Russia or China, ICBMs or potentially military forces would go over the Arctic. Greenland has an incredibly important strategic position. Greenland also has vast critical minerals and resources, and so there's strong economic reasons as well. Look, if we were to acquire Greenland, it would take likely a purchase from the nation of Denmark. It would take negotiations. That would be acquiring new territory. So your question of how much we should buy it for, that's a perfectly fair conversation that I'll tell you I had in the past 2 weeks with the ambassador of Denmark. Panama's a different situation. The nation of Panama did not build the Panama Canal. America did. The nation of Panama did not pay for the Panama Canal. America did. The nation of Panama did not give thousands and thousands of lives in building the canal. America did. And with Panama, the question is, are they complying with the treaty? Because when Jimmy Carter decided the American lives that were lost building the canal didn't matter, the trillions of dollars we spent didn't matter, he wanted to give it away anyway, at least we got a treaty in exchange for it. And so I think it is a perfectly fair and reasonable conversation to say, is Panama complying with the treaty? You know, it was striking. Panama severed ties with Taiwan in order to get closer to the People's Republic of China. And America, it is not in our interest to have China have a stranglehold on the Panama Canal. I mentioned the bridge that China is building across the canal. That gives them the ability, if we were in an economic or, God forbid, a military battle with China, that would give China the ability to shut down transit across the Panama Canal, which would have a massive negative consequence on the United States. And so I'm grateful for President Trump for raising these questions. And as I said, tomorrow, the Senate Commerce Committee, we're going to have a hearing asking and trying to get answers to every one of these questions.
Hey, Senator, two issues. I guess very specifically, what did the treaty say? Just being treated fairly? Or can you tell us exactly what the language is? Because it sounds like that is going to come down to what this all means. And then separately, what did the ambassador to Denmark say to you? Do they sound open to some sort of a deal?
Well, look, both questions. The treaty is called the Neutrality Treaty, and it required them to be neutral to treat the United States fairly. And actually, tomorrow we're going to have one of the witnesses at the hearing I've invited is an international law specialist to testify about what are the consequences of the treaty, what are the remedies to violations. And listen, this is early in the process of investigating and examining these questions. But I think America ought to be defending our own interests. And when it comes to the Panama Canal, you've got 75% of the transit across the Panama Canal is American transit, either U.S. military transit or U.S. commercial transit. And Panama's making roughly $3 billion a year as a consequence of the canal that we paid for and we built them. And so we ought to be vigorously enforcing the treaty. On the second point...
But before you get to the second point, let me just follow up with the first so we don't bounce back and forth. You just said that you don't agree that we should use our military to go take something back by force. But if we say you're not honoring the treaty, you're not treating us fairly, they say shove it, where does that leave us? Would you then use military force to take back something if you think they're violating a treaty?
Well, listen, I think there are all sorts of steps that you take long before military force. Now, it's worth noting, it's not like Panama has a terribly mighty military. If you remember when Manuel Noriega was there, we basically toppled him by playing loud music on boom boxes, and that was enough to topple him and arrest him for being a drug trafficker. And so, as a military matter, it's not complicated, but I don't think the principal tool of U.S. foreign policy should be using the military to engage. Rather, the principal tool ought to be enforcing our legal rights, using economic rights. And by the way, I think President Trump in the last 48 hours demonstrated an extraordinary measure of this with respect to Colombia. So you look at the elections in November, we had a clear mandate from the voters to secure the border. And so we've seen in the first week thousands of illegal immigrants being apprehended, being deported. There were 2 plane loads of illegal immigrants going back to the nation of Colombia, and Colombia's president, Petro, who's a hardcore socialist leftist, anti-American, decided he was not going to allow those planes to land. And it was really quite striking. President Trump announced, okay, then we will impose 25% tariffs on Colombia immediately. Within a week, it will ratchet up to 50%. And I've never seen anything like it. Within 8 hours, Colombia caved and said, we will happily accept the illegal immigrants back. And in fact, the president said, I'll send my presidential plane to pick them up. That's an example. We have all sorts of tools of leverage that are way short of military force.
Let me ask you 2 other questions. As a man of the law and someone who I know talks about the principles of the law, I'm curious 2 things that the president's done that I would imagine actually would outrage you, though I don't know if you would actually say it publicly, but I'm curious. One is firing the inspector generals, not firing the I'm not saying that that's the problem necessarily, but doing it without providing Congress with the 30 days that are enshrined in the law and describing in detail why. Is that something at all that upsets you, given that I do know you care about laws that you create?
Well, listen, under the Constitution, Article 2 of the Constitution gives the president the executive authority, and the executive authority is over every officer, every employee of the executive authority, and so the president has the authority under the Constitution to terminate people in the executive branch.
I'm saying that the law says, as you know, and was actually re-enshrined effectively a couple years ago, so that there was a 30-day requirement in terms of describing what was happening and the time period. Factually hasn't happened.
What I'm saying is the president has the authority to terminate people in the executive branch, and I also think inspectors general are incredibly important for ensuring that agencies are following the law. I'm confident the president is going to nominate serious, qualified people to be inspector general that will do exactly that.
But what about that part of the law? You think that's not a real law then?
I think at the end of the day, I'm looking at this first week of the administration, and I'm excited. I have never seen an administration with so much change, so much energy, and such a mandate from the voters.
I'm just asking you about the law itself, because there's like an actual law, and then what's happening, which is different.
Well,
and I think you
look, Andrew, under our Constitution, Congress and the President are designed to struggle back and forth. And so we can pass laws putting constraints on the executive, but it is not new for the executive to press back on Congress. And that back and forth was designed by the framers. That's part of the checks and balances. What's clear under Article 2 is the President, all executive power is vested in the President, and that's what he's exercising.
Senator, there's so much more to talk about. We got to run because we've got data, but I do hope we can continue the conversation. I always enjoy it, and I think we all learn a lot. Thank you, Senator.
I look forward to it.
You bet.
Rick Santelli is standing by at the CN.